This morning we have Arthur Jackson speaking on a humanist perspective, but not the humanist perspective. Longtime Humanist Community member and leader Arthur Jackson, who authored the book How to Live the Good Life, a user's guide for modern humanism, or modern humans, will offer a concise, focused talk on what humanism is and why it is important for individuals and for humanity. Arthur M. Jackson is currently the president of the board of the Humanist Community in Silicon Valley. He has been a member of the American Humanist Association and the Humanist Community for more than 50 years. So please welcome Arthur.
Thanks again, Greg, for those inspiring words. Just a couple of thoughts. There are some at the end of the talk. Let me say that again. If you haven't found it yet, there is a copy of the talk somewhere around you, and that is essentially every word you'll be hearing here. So if you find some words in there that didn't make sense to you and you'd like to either bring them up in the question and answer thing, you can make notes on that. I should warn you that this is a very short talk, but it's pretty succinct, and I hope that it raises some questions in your mind, things you've thought about or didn't think about, and that we can talk about them, because we'll have quite a bit of time to talk before we end for lunch. So prepare yourself for that eventuality, and give us all something to think about that otherwise maybe wouldn't have happened. The reason I called this talk a humanist perspective, not the humanist perspective, I explain a little bit in the talk, but essentially it's a matter of what humanism really is. That it isn't something written down and you say yes or no, but it's really a way of each of us coming to our own thoughts. How do we utilize what we learned in our childhood, the family we grew up in, and make it congruent with how we're thinking today? I hope that there will be some ideas in here that maybe will help us give something to focus on with that. Okay. I have been directly involved in the American Humanist Association, that is the AHA, since the early 60s. I explored other free thought organizations, but AHA was the best fit for me. You might be interested in knowing that AHA actually came out of efforts within Unitarian organizations. The persons doing this saw humanism as a religious position. There is an asterisk in that sentence, and that goes to individuals who were in the Unitarian position, who laid the foundation for humanism. They're mentioned there. I'll read them. Curtis Reese, John Dietrich, Bernadette Backus, Raymond Briggs, Ernest Caldecott, Albert Dieffenbach, Lester Mondale, Clinton Lee Scott, Frank Wicks, and Edward H. Wilson. And Edward Wilson is, I say, a cool person in all of this, and if there's questions, we can talk about that later. And then I go on to say, however, many current humanists object to thinking of humanism being religious in nature. And this speaks to the point that humanism is very broad and inclusive and resists simple universal definitions. My own definition is that humanism is the belief that human beings are the source of meaning and value, and that human morality derives necessarily from our evolutionary history. And I'll say candidly that that's the best definition I've ever heard. However, I've never found anybody else who agrees that that's with it. And I realize it is a little bit convoluted, so if at any point in the question and answer thing you'd like to dwell on that and find out more, well, what does that really mean, I'd be happy to do it. Humanism is not a set of doctrines, but more a collection of attitudes for living. To the humanist, the miracle is here and now. It is a miracle of nature. There is nothing supernatural about it. Everything depends on material causality. Spirit causality is not in the picture. Above all, humanists regard each individual person as ends in themselves, and not as means to achieve something, however desirable that something may be, such as maintaining the human species. Humanists are normally rationalists because they regard human reason as an essential guide in facing life's problems. But they are more than rationalists because they take into consideration the whole of human nature: desires, interests, sympathies, imagination, emotions, meaning, etc., not just the intellect. Plus, they realize that reason does not tell us about the world except to the degree that we have useful empirical knowledge that our experience and understanding allows us to successfully use. Let me say that again, because I realize it's a little convoluted and may differ from your own understanding on it. But this is a key thing, I think, to understand. All I have to do is find out where those inspiring words are. Okay. Plus, they realize that reason does not tell us about the world. Of course, the ancient Greek, the deep philosophers thought that by thinking about stuff, it told us what the world was like. Of course, modern science and things leading up to us has indicated that's really not the way the whole thing works. We need empirical knowledge based on our experience to test the assumptions that led to that rational idea. So in a very real sense, the humanist perspective could not be written, though humanism and its aspirations, produced by the American Humanist Association, also called Humanist Manifesto 3, provide some efforts in that direction. And in the footnote, I say if you want to get a copy of that, you go online to Humanist Manifesto 3, and it's all there. Also, other things outside of my talk are Creating Change Through Humanism by Roy Speckhard, Executive Director of the American Humanist Association, and he spoke to our group some weeks ago about the book, and to my mind, this, for the first time, really lays a basis for the American Humanist Association, because it tells about the history, it tells about the processes, and the American Humanist Association is really still in the process of coming into being. We spent the first 60 years at least trying to figure out what the hell we were, because AHA was set up to publish a magazine, The Humanist. The purpose of the magazine was to be given to Unitarians, be available to Unitarians so they could see the wisdom of humanism, and they would say, oh yeah, we're humanists. But that didn't happen, and AHA went off on its own path, and it's been on it ever since. Another, and one of the things that's included in Creating Change Through Humanism, pardon me, is the 10 Commitments. And there is a copy of the 10 Commitments in the book, also on a poster over there by the conference room door. And to my mind, they sort of, for the first time in a very clear way, even though Humanist Manifesto 3 was designed to say, okay, what is humanism, in a way that many people could agree with. And the way it was developed was they tried to put down what the core issues were, pass them around, edit them, change them, whatever. But it's not meant to be a consensus document, but more a way of looking at core kinds of ideas. Probably almost no one agrees totally with the Humanist Manifesto 3 because they see they give a spin to a particular word that sends it in a different direction. And you know, when rationalists get together, what they do, like they say, if you have a room with 11 people and free thinker types, they all will end up in a different enough position that they say, well, we're not in the same ballpark, so goodbye, never see you again. But hopefully humanism can find there is a core which we can connect on and feel there is value in being around people we can talk to. Not because we have to accept what they think, but rather they give us a way to think about what we think. And I know for myself personally, almost all of my ideas came from reading other people and what they think and thinking about it. And the whole purpose of writing my book, How to Live the Good Life, was to try to get it down so I would know what I thought. And if you've ever tried to figure out what you thought and say, well, was that yesterday or last week that I thought that? So I'm not drawing from those documents, but certainly in the question and answer period, anybody wants to bring those things up, I think we'll have time to kick them all around and see if we can use them in a useful way. For me personally, humanism is my religion. It is non-theistic and very concerned with building explicitly humanist communities. I see humanism as not just another religion, but rather a vision that would actually tie religion and science together by recognizing that meaning and values are not excluded from science. And of course, that's a key issue from my mind. Atheists particularly are very caught up on recognizing that there are no mystical forces that control us, but I think oftentimes they miss the boat. Once we get to that point, it's a matter, so what? How can we cooperate, work together to have a sense of community? Because human beings are social beings. We need connection and an opportunity to have friendships and support. And to my mind, that's what I see a humanist group as being. But it's hard to do with rationalists, partially because we have so many things on our mind. It's hard to focus on building community. But the meaning and values thing, most scientists and religious people, spiritually religious people, believe that that religion and science are in totally different domains. They have nothing to do with each other. I say they're totally wrong, and to the degree one accepts that, takes that position, I think they're directed into a blind alley where they really can't get to the important things. Through the understanding of human evolution, meaning and values can be defined in empirical terms. That's my assumption, which I'm willing to talk more about anytime given the opportunity. So meaning and values can be defined in empirical terms that not only fit within the domain of science, but actually expand science to provide a foundation for it that does not exist up to that point. And I reference my book there because that's the whole point of my book, to try to lay all that out so it's clear what the deepest issues are, and not getting diverted by some particular point. I see humanism as a unifying worldview that, when properly formulated and developed, would be the value system of that all humanity would share. That's why I see humanism as having the potential to provide a new foundation for civilization. And that ends my formal talk, and now we're ready to see what you think, and if you have questions or answers, to share them with us.
In order to record the questions along with the answers, please wait for the microphone before asking questions. When you have the microphone, remember to hold it close to your mouth. Also, please identify yourself before asking your question.
Thank you. Thank you. Arthur, my name is Mike Lebramson, sorry. So my question is related to your last statement. I see humanism as the unifying worldview that, when properly formulated and developed, would be the value system all of humanity would share. That I personally tend to agree with this, but my problem with this is how to explain why there are so few humanists there. And this is actually, it should be a very troubling question to all who share the humanist ideas. And I'm not talking about the formal membership, because the world religions, they don't have the formal membership, but they have millions of adherents and very active, those who deeply believe and feel their associations with their particular religions. What is there in humanism that prevents it from growing that much as other movements do? And I was thinking about several possible explanations, and I could not find any of them entirely satisfying. And at least I probably could rule out that the humanist values themselves are not in demand by society, because there are many people who, in my opinion, they share the same or many of these values, but still they don't feel any need to associate with humanist movement. And how would you explain this? Thank you.
Well, it certainly is a question that all of us have been working on as long as we've been involved in humanism. Certainly when I first learned about humanism, and let's step back. I would say that almost all persons who call themselves humanists have discovered it on their own. They read, they thought, they wondered, and they put it all together, and they came up with a view that most humanists would agree with. So they found it themselves, but let me say, most of those people, certainly not all of them, but most of those people are very happy about thinking in their own minds and maybe talking to a friend, and they don't see any reason for a group. I mean, why would I want to go to a group, particularly on Sunday morning, for crying out loud? So as a result, they're not really joiners. They're not persons who feel a need for outside reinforcement for their ideas, because they've thought about it so long, it's clear to them that they're pretty close to the answer. For some of them, that answer is there is no God, and what more do you need? So I think part of it is in that domain. Another part, as I sort of was dancing around earlier, was what is a humanist organization in the United States of America? We lacked clarity on that when the whole organization was incorporated in 1941, and I'd say we've only started to get to the answer now with Roy's book, Creating Change Through Humanism. So that's another part of the whole thing. Let me present. See, most of us are really glory in the fact we have separation of church and state in the United States of America, the first country to ever do that, because most countries are based on ethnic groups that do have a religion, and it's the binding thing in that society. Therefore, it's important to them to incorporate that religion in their national structure. Since the United States didn't do that, we took a different route. It did leave us with this issue. Take a country like England, where the Church of England is the unifying religious structure, or used to be anyway, under England. And those, so if you wanted to get married or happened to die and needed to bury you and all that, it was done within that context. And the church and that religion drew from the state funds to build buildings, to pay ministers, to do the things that a society needs, that is, to build a connective tissue in the society so people do feel part of it. They are willing to give up a short-term gain for the better good. And I think that's deeply ingrained in human beings. I think it's in our genetics. However, it bounces around. But if we look at say, Norway, probably, and Netherlands also another good example of it, after World War II, when a lot of people were just disillusioned about Christianity because they saw some terrible things going on there under the guise of Christianity, so they felt that no longer really felt right for them to be identified with that. So that's when the International Humanist and Ethical Union was founded as an organization of national organizations. And the purpose of that was to figure out how to do humanism in a society. How do you do it? You know, religious organizations have hundreds, thousands of years behind them of building structures. Of course, we can look at some that don't, like Scientology and Mormonism and all that. But anyway, there's a lot to look at in there. But what I'm trying to say is, because those states, those individuals, and in those times were able to set themselves up within the religious structure and are provided state monies to do that. And they were able to do that because there was no separation of church and state. But people were realizing that the national religion wasn't necessarily an essential part of things. And as a result, they were able to use state funds. And it turned out that even up to today, the biggest humanist organization in the world is the Norwegian Humanists. And the reason for that, a combination of things. One of them, they received state support. Why did they receive state support? Because in Norway, they had that tradition when kids reach a certain age, they need a coming-of-age ceremony. And for Norwegians in the Lutheran Church, that was a big deal. So, but those families who didn't function within the Lutheran Church, and the kids would say, but where's our coming-of-age ceremony? And those people, for whatever reason, got it right and said, okay, let's have a humanist coming of age ceremony. So they started doing that. And there was the demand that allowed that to provide a foundation for building an organization around. And we have not found such a thing in the United States. And that's part of the issue. But I think I'll stop talking now, and I think maybe other people might have something to throw in.
Hi, I'm Chip, also known as James Hunt. I want to continue the same question topic of coalescing upon a single shared value and suggest that that's an impossibility, that people are different, values will always be different. We may be able to find a cloud, but we have to realize that our target is not a point, but a cloud. How do you comment on that?
No, I think that's the whole point. I mean, because we're so used to seeing, okay, you write these things down, everybody agrees to them, and if you don't, we may not kill you immediately, but we're sure going to make it, you think it might be a better solution. We see that so clearly in the Muslim religion today. Of course, Christianity went through that a few hundred years before, and they were able to make it through the point, okay, it's not, you don't have to agree with every one of the things. If you agree with some of them, you're still one of us.
Martin Luther lived. So.
Yeah.
I really have to comment on your last comment about Islam. I think that if you knew the Muslim members of your community, if you really had good relationships with them, you would know that they are more humanists than the Christians I know. We spent a few years in Saudi Arabia, so I do know whereof I speak, and I think that an outreach of that kind, in order to dispel the kinds of comments that you had, would probably be a step that humanists, from what you've said, would logically take.
Well, don't give her the mic. Let's talk about Saudi Arabia, because you have actual experience there.
Yes, I do.
All I know is what I read in the papers and whatever.
Oh, good. That's a very good place to learn from.
And certainly Saudi Arabia, of course, there was a time where that was more, keep it straight. Well, maybe all I need to say is Saudi Arabia hasn't really got there yet.
Got where?
To a place where most of us would feel comfortable living and being able to thrive and spot.
We loved being in Saudi Arabia. I loved being in Saudi Arabia. Had my husband not gotten sick, we would still be there 14 years later. We would never have left.
And what was your situation living there and meeting with fellow, Saudi Arabians and the laws and the rules and the regulations?
They were very simple rules to what you would do if you were in somebody's house as a guest. And they said, well, we'd like you to take off your shoes. It's one of the things that we do here. So you don't make a big fuss about taking off your shoes when you walk into somebody's house like that. So if they want me to wear an abaya, which is a really easy thing, it's a little cloak you throw on, that's fine. We were expats, and that is, I understand, and I appreciate the difference between living in Saudi Arabia, and things have changed a great deal since we were there, and being an expat there. But what I found was that the values of the Saudis and the other Muslims I met Muslim women from all over the Middle East. Those values centered on what I would call humanist values. That is to say, they focus on the family, they focus on interpersonal relationships, they focus on peaceful existence, and they focus on how to make that happen. How do you support one another to see that we live in a peaceful community? For instance, in Saudi, in Riyadh, if there was a traffic accident, of which there were many, it would not be uncommon for 50 Saudis to gather around when this fender bender or whatever happened to make sure that the two people didn't argue, didn't fight. And this would go on either in stores if there was any kind of trouble at all. There was a great, and so what we found was there is a sense of peace in Saudi Arabia that I found nowhere else. It seeps into your very soul. And people treat each other with kindness, with generosity, and with respect.
Well, thank you for sharing your experience. I appreciate it, having it as part of the discussion today.
I'd like to preface what I'm going to say about Saudi Arabia with the notion I've always had that humanism has as one of its most important precepts the concept that we bear responsibility for one another as members of the human race. Now, with regard to Saudi Arabia, I'm delighted that this lady has such a good experience and such a good opinion of Saudi Arabia, but I'd like to mention that in the news in the last few days, perhaps some of you have heard of it, there is a big discussion of the 28 pages. The 28 pages in question are the last 28 pages of an 838-page report put out by the Joint Inquiry on the Terrorist Attacks of September 11th, 2001, headed by Senator Bob Graham. The last 28 pages of that report were excised, prohibited, censored, cut out by President Bush and later his successor, Barack Hussein Obama, and the FBI. Just a week or so ago, Senator Bob Graham, who has written everything from a novel to another book trying to urge the United States to become aware of those 28 pages, he appeared on 60 Minutes. And it was very interesting to hear what he had to say. His questioner asked him, now, do you think that these 28 pages, actually Senator Graham helped author them, so he knows exactly what's in them. He just hasn't been allowed to talk about them. And his interviewer asked him, do they deal with the Saudi family, royal family's complicity, or Saudi charities, or Saudi upper class people? And Senator Graham said flatly and blankly, all of the above. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has been complicit in many different terror organizations, and those 28 pages and many other sources of this information explain that Saudi Arabia is implicated in the deaths of several thousand people in the United States and many thousands of people elsewhere. It preaches an ugly Wahhabist religion of the very most vile and violent form of a very violent ideology. So I'm sorry, I just can't believe that those things are being said here. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, let us say this about that. This is not a program on the Muslim religion or Muslim nations, and I hope that you'll spare us getting into that. Maybe we'll have another time. Certainly at the question and answer time, that's part of what that is about. But let's please divert from that. Sorry I waded into it, but on the other hand, not. Because we all live in this world, and where are we going to go with it? And those things are very real.
Absolutely.
Yeah, hi Arthur. I want to say that I found this very readable. It's a well-written page, and part of that might be that it's short, and I actually read the whole page. But going back to the comment Chip made, and I think, the phrase that stuck in my mind was the science of meaning and values, and I may be rehashing that, but I think what my feeling about that is that meaning and values are kind of things that arise from the individual and from their life, and it's hard to pin down a science because even though there's a lot of commonality in what we want from life, there's also a lot of different attitudes, there's different brain structures. I'm wondering how far you want to go with the idea that there is a science of values.
I want to go all the way, and I want to give appreciation to I think it's David Harris who waded into that whole domain by saying we can in fact look at values, and sure they differ. I mean, just from the conversation we've had here today, we see all the kinds of differences that come out when you start talking. But the point of it is, human beings are social beings. We have certain needs, and those can be studied, and they can be examined, and they can be built on. And to my mind, and I say that for me, that's what has to happen, because the core of that is how each person can live a satisfying, joyful life and not harm other people. And I deal a lot with that in my book, although I realize they're all words and you can define them differently and come up with different conclusions. But the point of it is that building a society that has those kinds of patterns in a sustainable way is the challenge, because anything else, I mean, in my own mind, I think the human species, the species to which all of us in this room belong, is very close to coming to the end of the line. And to my mind, a lot of that comes out of mistakes that we've made. So far, we've been able to correct mistakes. I mean, I think the United States of America was an unbelievably wonderful experiment. But it happened in such an unlikely way. And it was because of the way it happened that there were able to be things like separation of church and state and other kinds of procedures that we have that you don't have any place else in the world. So, I'll give you that's not an easy question to answer. And I think any person who's a skeptic has a right to be skeptical on that point. But for me, that's not just an idle comment. Oh yeah, wouldn't it be nice too? To the degree that I've tried to dig into anthropology and genetics and all the things that allow structures to function well, I see those are problems that can be overcome. But let's move on to that.
Thank you. My name is Jake, and I just wanted to follow up on the same thing as what prevents humanism from growing more. And I guess I clearly don't have any answer to that, but my thought process was that I think sort of evolutionary biologists have been looking at that there's a need for religion, and that religions have served certain purposes in societies. Maybe, by unifying societies, you can build much bigger structures than we can individually. And I read a lot. I really liked a series. Joseph Campbell had a theory on the series on the power of mythology with Bill Moyers, and it talks about that essentially all religions have common elements in them. And maybe a lot of these elements are things that humans need, that serve a function for humans. And I haven't enumerated these, and I don't know whether anyone has, but maybe, I've heard other people talk about like atheist groups that say like they really miss a sense of community that religious organizations have. So if we could, if humanists can come up with some sort of set of ideas or principles that humans need, and a way to build these into a more rational structure, I guess, some of the things I thought the Dalai Lama said was it would be nice if you could have religions which take the good parts and you don't have to argue about the bad parts. So, for example, there's probably extremists in all religions who take things literally and don't find the meaning behind that and then follow the literal stuff. So I guess the only thoughts I have is like if we could come up with some sort of set of ideas or things that humans need and try to incorporate that into humanism, that might be a way to make it grow, to fulfill what other people are getting fulfilled in the other religions.
Yeah.
And so,
well, I sometimes think I have the answer until I start talking to people. But here's where I start in that whole thing. And part of the reason I called, well, to my mind, it all goes back to meaning of life. Now, if you try to talk to most rationalists about meaning of life, first they'll shine you off. That has no meaning. Forget about it. That actually happened to me personally because I started from a philosophy paper I was doing in college based on the idea meaning of life has got to be the basis of any ethical system. But one of the members of the humanist community pointed out to me that I didn't have any empirical data to back that up. It was just I pulling it out of thin air and saying that. So I started, okay, is there any way to approach that in an empirical way? And the way I got around it, and so far nobody has convinced me I'm wrong, is that any person who gets through a day and goes to bed has a meaning of life. In other words, if you have no meaning for your life, you do go over the bridge. You do blast your brains out. Now, many people in their life, not because of a lack of meaning, but a lack of their body is no longer one that they want to put up with in the circumstances. But to my mind, that underlying thing, we must have a meaning of our life. But most humanists would disagree with that. Oh, no, you don't need a meaning of your life. You just, you know, you have a job and you do stuff and whatever. But the point of it is, by focusing on that point, it gives you a way to build empirical data. What is it that really provides that meaning to your life? And the easy answer for rationalists is, oh, it's different things. It's different for this and this and that. So don't think about it. But the point of it is, in science, we think about stuff, and we find things that seem impossible to all of a sudden start coming together. I mean, of course, astrology, to my mind, is a prime example. Astrology has been around since the stars, more or less, but the point of it is, the astrology was used to explain things in the world, and those with a scientific bent say, if you're going to explain anything in the world, you really have to study this stuff. And you don't just say, well, if this planet was there and this star was there, then that means you're loving or whatever. And all the work that's been done on that, of course, shows there's no scientific validity to it, but it's still around. Why is it still around? Because somehow that gives answers to people. It helps them figure out how to be today, or to pretend how they're going to be today, or whatever people do with information that doesn't make any sense if you look at it deeply. And so somewhere in my mind is the foundation for a science of religion, which would be focused on what does any person need to keep living. And if we study enough people, I think it'll start shaking out those things that do fit and those things that don't. Of course, we get into the problem and say, well, if you're a sociopath, then killing people is fun, so you do it. But again, if we look deeper, I mean, superficially, we come up with that kind of stuff. Why do we come up with that kind of stuff? Because we don't want to look any deeper. You know, we all have ways of ignoring things other people believe and we think are wrong. So we look at what they believe and say, oh, that's crazy, and never get to what the question that was brought up earlier about what's really underneath that. Maybe it was you who brought that up. Looking underneath that stuff and what's really there, rather than just the words we sometimes use to talk about it.
I have a few questions. How many people know someone, an acquaintance, a family member, a friend, who does not know what humanism is? Looks like most people. How many of you in the past month have tried to explain what humanism is to someone who didn't know? Wow, more than I thought, but maybe a quarter of us. I suspect that far more people in majority religions are comfortable doing that. And the reason is that being in the majority, they don't see any stress from being told about or talking about the majority religions. Many of the people in the humanist community come from a feeling of oppression or at least annoyance at people who try to dominate their way of thinking and don't acknowledge their own ability to think for themselves and to have a humanist viewpoint. And they probably carry with that a reluctance to evangelize or even educate others about humanism. So perhaps we could do better at educating people about humanism.
Thank you. You are right in this observation, but I think it is derived not that much from this feeling of being in minority, but rather from tendency of people of like more closely associated with humanism. So they have very strong feeling of like tolerance to others' opinions, and that everyone is entitled to their views, even if we don't agree with their views. And so we tend to be like not very pushy in promoting our views, and it's not necessarily true if we are talking about religious people, because religious people generally they assume that they know the truth, and if you don't agree with me, it's because probably you don't know who Jesus was, or that for some reason you don't know the truth. So I have to tell you. But people of more humanistic views, they tend to be like more restrictive, self-restrictive in the ways of promoting their views. So at least this is like my personal feeling, and I don't know how common it is.
Yeah. Well, hopefully all those personal opinions add up, and and they're part of the answer. But figuring out how to build on it is the tough part.
Thank you, Arthur. First, a potentially ingratiating but honest comment. I really appreciated your talk and perspectives and respect them. They're as valid as you point out anyone else's, first of all. I'd like to focus on a couple things. In here you talk about to the humanist, the miracle is here and now, and then you talk about humanists regard individual persons as ends in themselves. And to me, that's sounding a little bit like, I don't know, I'm not the great philosopher, but existential, Nietzsche, it's all about me. And also it brings up thoughts in my mind of just very convenient and self-indulgent. You know, like we have Catholics or other religions, you know, I'm a Catholic, but I don't believe in this, this, and this. Well, I don't think you're a Catholic. Okay, so say you're something else. Thank you.
Yeah, well, it's certainly a valid point, and it's true. I mean, everything I say is based on assumptions, and I'm willing to change those assumptions if I get a good enough reason to. And I would hope that's true of every other humanist. But the part of it is that to my mind, a selfish person is merely a person who doesn't have enough experience or knowledge. Those are assumptions. But I have read some things about people and how they behave and whatever. And I think it's sad, in the last several generations, we have been, I'll call it indoctrinating, for lack of a better word, our kids into that me idea. It's all about me, what I can do, how I can do it, and whatever, rather than realizing every me needs those other me's. At a minimum, you needed a mom, and those who had dads who were there to support them benefited greatly from that. But I see that whole dimension things is left out of our conversations. It's like I'm recently started realizing you read a book, you see a TV program, and it's all about what that person did. It's almost never about, well, why would somebody do a thing like that? Because, see, in this society, it's obvious. Why would a person steal something? Because they're bad people. And bad people, we know, are all around us. And everybody has a bad streak and will do bad things. We don't get into what's really going on in the human brain that causes a person to harm somebody else. Not only sometimes harm them, but in the case of sociopaths, of apparently deriving some pleasure from that. To my mind, that says something about how a human brain is working. And I think it would be better to spend a few $1 billion on understanding how human brains work and have one less aircraft carrier in the Atlantic. But at any rate, and to my mind, talking about these things are helpful. We may not come up with an answer, but possibly if we dance around long enough. Like I say, I came out of the conviction that meaning of life is just so obvious. Of course. It wasn't until I was really hit in the eyes, and the person that did that, how could they even say that? Of course it's obvious. It must be sort of dumb. It took months before I really realized, you know, this guy is talking about something real, something that I've totally overlooked because it's outside of my range of thinking at that time. And I had to, in retrospect, appreciate that person for giving me an opportunity to look at an error that I had just incorporated and couldn't even see. And of course, we all have errors such as that in our life, because how do we recognize an error when we know we're right?
I guess I have the mic now. It's Carl. And, you know, I wanted to go way back to when we were talking about how's it coming that humanism doesn't spread around very much. And I had one idea introduced to me by an old Unitarian minister I knew many years ago who started me on my path to atheism because he was an atheist. The first guy I ever saw in a church who said, "No God talk here." Okay? And they fired him, of course. So, but that's beside the point. He became a Unitarian minister at large, and he speaks around the country a lot. And we used to have long conversations about these kinds of topics. And one of the questions was, how come Unitarians are also such a small group? I mean, you know, they're tiny too. And a lot of people agree with them, and they're very tolerant, for example, maybe more tolerant than we are in some ways. But he said that there was one thing he saw in common with all religions. They have to have a completely idiotic, dumb idea that you must believe in order to be a member of that group. It doesn't matter what it is, some mythical story, whatever, some magic thing, some, like, I even thought the Buddhists were, you know, were getting much closer to where it was. And then, of course, they believe in, you know, afterlives after afterlives or whatever, and all kinds of things which, of course, there's no rational basis for. But there is a need for people to want to live forever, for example. So one easy myth is you can live forever. Join us, you live forever. And boy, that's really a good sales. I mean, that's a real sales pitch. I mean, unbelievable amount of money are spent by people to live forever. So anyway, I'm an ex-Catholic, and I just, after I learned about how it used to work, I mean, my goodness. Well, you hear that here. You know, you buy your way into wherever it is, right, by paying money. So anyway, speak to the idea of what's a nutty idea humanists could absorb. See, one of my ideas would be something like this. You know, that people can actually be tolerant, that we can build a world, like the one fellow that talked said, we can build a world that is such that when a child is born, it's set up, the structure for the human beings that live in that society, such that even the lowest one or the highest one have an equal opportunity to reach their maximum potential. Now that's a really nutty idea. Anyway, I'll stop.
Yeah. Well, but you raise a real good point, because it goes back to the point that underneath any fact that you are convinced of is so clear and proven by all kinds of scientific methods, there are assumptions. And the assumptions, I won't say they can't be questioned, but we don't question them, because if you question that basic assumption, then you can't get to all the other steps that come after. And of course, the Greeks were somewhat familiar with that whole thing. Well, if we can do that, fantastic.
Well, I think Carl's point is made when you realize that you can't secure loyalty to the group if you ask them to believe something that makes sense. So,
like put money in the pot.
Okay.
This is asking half tongue-in-cheek, but Alfred's my name. If someone says, I love humanity, but I hate people, does that qualify him as a humanist?
Well, let me say this about that. Many humanists might say that, but I think it really doesn't, because it gets back to the thing of what do we expect of other people? See, and part of the thing, our expectations is they would be kinder and gentler and nicer and smarter and more active and all the good things. But all of us are functioning within the process of how we got to this point. And of course, we don't want to get into the millions of years of pre-genic kind of thing. But I think it's also a matter of when I first discovered people believed like I did, and they called it humanism, and so I decided to use the term and got involved in organizations. I found some of those humanists lie. Some of those humanists say things that aren't true. And I said, wait a minute, humanists are perfect people. I mean, they do everything right. I mean, they're grounded on all those things. How can that happen? And it finally hit me, you know, humanists are human too. We're still living out all the stuff that was stuffed into us over however many years we've been around, and a lot of that happening in the first 10 years. And many of us haven't made it out of the first 10 years yet, let alone the remaining 40 or however many it is. But it's a very good question, and I think it's one that deserves a lot more thinking, because I think it is a thought that many of us have had. And part of that, I think, comes out of the fact we are individualists. I mean, how do you get out of a evangelical religious dimension that explains everything in terms of your sin and how terrible you are, and if you don't do it this way, you're doomed to hell and brimstone? If anybody who goes through that process and comes out as a halfway healthy person has already become convinced in the validity of their own thinking, and are not. And so when we see other people wandering around, it's easy to write them off, and that's the easiest thing to do, right? When people do something dumb and stupid, we just shrug it off, oh, they're just dumb and stupid, rather than saying, if we're going to build a society where we all can cooperate and we all work together and we all help each other, we have to help each other work through their stupidities and our own stupidities. And I haven't found anybody yet, including myself, who doesn't have a few stupidities still in their minds. But they're there not because we're evil or stupid or unwilling to question, but because we just haven't gotten put in the mechanism where we had to confront that in a useful way. So we could, in fact, throw that process out. So. We got another.
This has been a fantastic discussion, and it's one of the things that I love coming here, and I'm glad that we are able to come back and join you.
And I'm glad you came. Let me say that about that.
What you just said about sin, that religions talk about, you know, you're sinful, and so you have to go through all these things so that you can be forgiven and move on. How does humanism address sin and forgiveness? Because this seems to be a real big drawing point for religions, and there must be some way to address that within the humanist community.
Well, there are many things we haven't figured out how to address up to this point, and I think because the amazing part, religion in today's America is not necessarily doing so well, particularly in the old mainline churches. Basically, their membership is falling away, falling away, falling away. The growth is in the evangelical dimensions, where somebody stands in front of you and say, you sinners, you got to get straight, otherwise you're going to go to hell, and let me explain what hell really is. Because, and I went, why would a person go and hear themselves being put down and diminished, and that at one level that's a mystery.
But they do address it because we know we're sinful. I mean, all human beings, and we know that we have sinned.
Can you wait for the mic, please?
That we need forgiveness, and so humanism must address that in some way. I just don't know how.
Well, the point of it is sin doesn't exist. I mean, there is no such thing as sin.
Well, you know what are you doing? It's wrong, and you know it's wrong.
There is harm. We consider humanism, an important characteristic of humanism is trying to avoid harming other humans.
Yes, yes. But what I'm really trying to say is there are words in our society that have power, and sin has power. And for any humanist who doesn't really believe in sin, they still have that part of their brain, well, you know, people can do awful, cruel things. They can do dishonest things. And probably that's what they're doing. And we've never made a powerful enough image that, you know, there's also that preciousness in each one of them, that tenderness, that connective part. And we may not always do things that fit for that, but it's not because we're sinful or whatever. It's because we don't know in the circumstances where how could we avoid that? Because let's face it, we're impinged in all kinds of ways that make it very difficult for us to be humanists in fact as well as name.
A humanist who doesn't understand, who doesn't accept the reality of sin, doesn't understand the term and how it's used in Christian theology or in common sense.
Thank you.
Well, I'm sure you'll enlighten us in a speech coming up soon, right, Paul? But we have a mic up here.
Okay. Yeah, just a small point. Who here besides me, who reads Skeptic magazine. The most recent one had articles by Shermer, Harris, and
someone else.
Someone else, yes. Pinker, Steven Pinker. And they all were arguing around this question about can science tell us anything about oughts? Yeah, ought to, that we ought, what we ought to do. And both Shermer and Harris seem to think that that's possible. So,
yeah, and that's where Harris sort of broke the line when he came up with his initial book and some of that thinking, where he, not his initial book, but the later ones where he got into the issue. And to my mind, ought is just a word, and any word can be defined in a better way. And one of the things I discovered in my own writing is we all have had words stuck into our minds in the process of growing up. And we were stuck also with definitions of those words. Take a definition of religion. Religion is a big word. And what does it mean? So you go to the dictionary. There are 6 definitions there. Some of them talk about God and prayer and whatever. And one of them talks about community, sport, and fellowship, and those kind of values. And what does the atheist say? Religion is a terrible word because it supports the supernatural, and anytime you use that word, you are falling into their hands, and you're an awful person, and get it straight, or otherwise you're not welcome here. So what I'm trying to say is, under every word there are all kinds of possibilities, and we don't have to accept. For example, to me, the ought, and this is sort of what Harris went off on, was in terms of the things that actually work in the world empirically. It's a matter of why ought you to do something? If you are doing it in order for you to live the best life you can, then you have a way of looking at the ought. If you do the ought because somebody said you ought to, or you should, then you're a puppet in their hands, because they get to define the word and tell you what you're supposed to do. And all I'm trying to say is we need to avoid letting other people define what we should do. But at any rate, I think we must be.
We're out of time. So thank you, Arthur.